Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge.
Hi. This episode is about the different game that we are now playing in the age of AI, and why and how education, organizations, and our careers need to evolve. To discuss this new game, I'm delighted to be speaking with Thomas Arnett, Senior Research Fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute. Thomas's research focuses on disruptive innovations in K through 12 education and the changing roles of teachers in blended learning environments. Hi, Thomas. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Great to be with you.
Wonderful to be speaking with you. Starting quickly, we have a lot to get through. You studied economics. Why?
I like understanding how the world works. When I was a kid, I loved those books that made cross-section diagrams of different devices. And so for a long time, I thought I'd be an engineer. Okay. But ultimately, after some experiences I had in college, decided I want to try to figure out how to solve the human problems in the world, not just the mechanical or electrical. And economics was a great field for having some math and some models that try to make sense of why people do the things they do and why markets work the way they do, why organizations operate the way they do. So it captivated my attention.
Soon after college, you then actually became a math teacher to begin with, and then did an MBA, which seemed to have a focus on technology. How did that evolution happen?
Well, so while studying economics, my senior year, I took a class on the economics of education. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I met a Teach for America recruiter. And Teach for America is this program in the US where they recruit college grads that didn't necessarily study education, but were top-notch in whatever field they were in to go into education. I had a sense of, the world could be better if we better supported people from different backgrounds and if we helped people better fulfill their potential. And education seemed like an entry point into figuring out how to do that kind of work. At the same time, teaching middle school is not easy. Being a new teacher is not easy. It was a very stressful job. And as I did it, though, I came to realize that, yes, it's hard because it's like teaching's always hard for new teachers, but part of it's hard is because of the way the education system works, the way schools operate. That was probably the optimal design 100 years ago, but is outdated in many ways for today. And so I had a sense of there's got to be a better ways to do education, and went to graduate school to figure out how do I get into that part of not just working in education, but figuring out how to reinvent education.
You joined the Clay Christensen Institute, one of the entities that I honestly admire the most in terms of future of work, how he was and how the Institute has been looking at and trying to work out where we are going, where we should be going, how we can, make changes and all that kind of stuff. Why did you choose there with a focus on, or your focus on education? And how has that evolved over time? Because you've been there, over a decade.
I had this sense that I want to help make the world better. I think education is a big part of that. And I had just a sense of commitment to, hey, students I'm working with, they need better opportunities. They need better pathways to opportunity. How do I make a difference in this space that I feel committed to? And it was while I was in grad school, I read the book that Clayton Christensen, Michael Horn, and Curtis Johnson wrote that talked about, the future of education. And at the time, the term they were using was moving toward a more student-centric model of education.
Right.
But what really captivated me about the book is that there's lots of people out in the world that have ideas for how to do education better, how schools could be different. And some of those ideas have been around for a long time. But the challenge I often mentally ran into was, look, a lot of these ideas aren't new, but how do they ever become mainstream? That despite all the great ideas out there, schools aren't changing. And what I found really compelling about their book was they had a theory that mapped out, how do we get there? How does the system actually change toward these new models? Not just, here's some great models, if only we could get there.
How have they managed to do that? AI notwithstanding, there has needed to be a very serious updating of education for a while. And, urgently for the last 15 years, say, in terms of, thinking about skills, focusing on self-direction, thinking, really being able to prepare people for a very different workforce because they're not ready when they come out of high school or college.
The core insight that I drew from their book is that systems usually don't reinvent themselves. Systems get designed to solve certain problems, and they get really good at doing the things they were designed to do, but not very good at doing things that are radically different from what they're originally designed to do. Clayton Christensen had coined the term disruptive innovation when in his research, he'd looked at a lot of industries and seen, well, there's this pattern where big, well-established, well-resourced organizations kind of get stuck. And then a new innovation comes along that looks very different from what they've done in the past, and they can't figure out how to do it. And it's usually new entrants into the field that figure out that new innovation and then eventually end up transforming the whole field as that new innovation evolves into something more robust and something that is compelling as a mainstream solution. So that process almost creates like this natural cycle of like death and rebirth in a lot of sectors of society, which is how we end up solving a lot of the challenges. I mean, the disruptive innovation has often a lot of positive side effects where it takes things that are often scarce and makes them much more abundant and much more available. So think of like computers in the 1950s. If you wanted to access a computer, you had to work at a large firm or a big research organization and get a PhD in computer science. Today, we all carry computers in our pockets that are way more capable than those machines, right? And that's the disruptive innovation is the phenomena that brings that process about. So, looking at school systems face the same, what Christensen called the innovator's dilemma, that natural process that plays out that makes an organization struggle to adopt disruptive innovation. School systems, like many incumbent organizations, like they're caught in their own innovator's dilemma. And so they mapped out in their book, here's how disruptive innovation can play out in education to transform the education systems. Some of the challenges, though, is that, education is not like a consumer good, and it doesn't operate just in a free market setting. And there's many good reasons why we don't operate education that way. I'd say the core dynamics are the same, but a lot of the nuances are different. And my work for the last decade has been digging into those nuances and trying to get us to a better map of here's how the transformation is actually going to play out.
We have needed to change some of the ways that we're educating because of laptops in the classroom. There were pushes to use technologies and limitations to show, to guide how not to be using or not to be cheating. And that changed how one presented, teachers had to present problems. Now, of course, we've got that on steroids. It has caused a major need to disrupt oneself in terms of some of these, the courses, how they're presented. Do you go back to, pen and paper? And if you're not going to go back to that, then how can that reasonably happen in our education systems now?
Well, I think one of the amazing things about disruptive innovation, but also one of the things that is often surprising to people, is that disruptive innovation is not a top-down process. I mean, we often see disruptive innovations when they've already played out in the world, and we think, wow, this amazing new innovation came and made all our lives better or changed the way the world works. But disruptive innovations typically start off on the margins, and they start off looking really crummy compared to what the established system does.
All right.
But despite the fact that they're crummy, they're good at a few things that the established solutions aren't good at. And those few things that they're good at that are different make them appealing often to people who don't have access to the mainstream solutions or who are overserved by the mainstream solutions or just are eager to take a trade-off and say, like, I'll give up a lot of what the mainstream solution offers to get something that's different. So they take root in that space and they still look crummy, but then they evolve over time. And it's that evolution that eventually makes them good enough to be comparable to the mainstream solution. And that's when people start to migrate. And that's when the disruption happens. That's when the world seems to change overnight. But what people often miss is that there's actually a long process that plays out before that transformation happens.
So I'm thinking of the flipped classroom model, which I think was one of those, right? My son actually had that, 10, 12 years ago, in terms of, you can watch this, you'll actually do the learning at home, and then you come and in the classroom and you're going to ask questions. And it is something that was clunky to begin with, and now I think it's I don't know how much it's used widely, but I think it is a clever use of being able to adapt to people's different learning styles and the amount of time they need to read or watch a different video. Coming to AI and being able to tailor education to the individual student, which could be incredible, right?
I think we need to be really cautious about where we think about AI, where it's going to have impact. So one of the things they called out in Disrupting Class, that book that they wrote almost 2 decades ago, was that a lot of technology just gets crammed into the existing school system. It gets used to take the existing instructional model and just tweak it and make it marginally better. And I think that's mostly what we've seen with all technologies over the last 2 decades. And even now with AI, most of the AI getting used in schools today is educators using it to plan their lessons more effectively and more quickly, to do grading more effectively or more quickly. Students using it to get their assignments done for better or for worse more quickly. Like it's not rethinking the assumptions of how school works. It's just using it to try and enhance the way the school system has always worked.
Teachers too, but kids are I've had a lot of concern about, brain rot. I don't feel like I've learned as much when I go through the process of, putting an essay together or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And I think one thing to keep in mind is in a lot of ways, school is an artificial game. We've made up these activities and these credits and these sequences of courses, not because those are inherently what humans need for development, but because we've constructed this game and now we've got this technology that helps you win at the game, but actually lose at the purpose of the game in a sense.
Or is it a different game?
Well, I think we need to shift to a different game.
Right. Or we're playing a different game. It's not about jobs, it's about skills. And so if I'm not being prepared to be a lawyer or to be a doctor or that's the track, one of the 30 tracks that's ahead, and I have to be ready for anything, then the game is different, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the challenge that society is wrestling with right now, or that we need to wrestle with, is that we need to change the game, but the old game is still the one that most people are playing. And it's not clear what the new game should be.
Right.
We're figuring that out. So
yeah. And I think that is one of the fascinating and incredible elements of the challenge, that we are in the midst of the transformation phase. And so if people want clarity, it's just not there right now. Now we're to where we are. We know it's a different game. We're thinking about some of the people who are trying to define the new game. They are, we're talking about big tech here, and some companies that are really massively financed. They're also the people playing the game with the investors. And it's I wouldn't necessarily say a virtuous circle, but it's certainly a spiral that's going upwards. So you wrote a paper called "What Actually Determines AI's Impact on Humanity?" And the paper itself is very different from what that title suggests, in fact, because you go into a lot of detail about the different players, these different big tech players who are creating a new game, and what, I guess I would frame it in, what are the elements of that game? What does it mean with all these different players, how the interactions are working, and what that means in terms of rewards and trade-offs, and what that could mean for the rest of us, what the impact of AI is based on the game that these guys are creating right now.
So I don't have all the answers to that question. And I don't think anyone does. I mean, we're in a very uncertain time, and if someone seems really confident, it's probably because confidence sells, not because they have the right answers.
So well said. And for them, it has to sell, right?
Yeah. But I think what that paper tries to do is unpack, okay, let's see what the actual influences are on these organizations, aside from what their stated goals and priorities may be. So I think OpenAI is actually a really interesting case study. So it starts off as this nonprofit that's going to do AI for the good of humanity. And then we just saw the big trial between Musk and Altman, where Musk was upset that it turned into a for-profit company and that he didn't get to benefit from it. But underlying that is the reality that they say, well, if we want to develop this technology, it's going to require a lot more resources than we're going to be able to get through nonprofit fundraising. So we need to become a for-profit company. So their mission's one thing, but their business model steers them in a different direction. I think you fast forward to even more recently, for a long time, for the last few years, OpenAI had been in this space of like, we're just going to create this great technology and let it be used for a lot of different things. I remember Altman in an interview saying, they want it to be out there so anybody can use it, because we don't know, what poor kid in a developing part of the world is going to use AI to invent some new thing that no one else in the world will discover. And like, that's a very noble vision. But then fast forward and
when you need to raise $100 billion.
yeah. And you've raised a bunch of money, and those investors didn't just give you money because they see you as a charity. They want their return back. And then, Anthropic jumps ahead and Gemini jumps ahead. And all of a sudden OpenAI is saying, look, we have to shut down all these side projects so we can focus on, what's going to be the sustainable business model. And we're going to need to put ads into our AI, even though Altman had said years ago he felt really uncomfortable with that. All of this is driven by the need.
Let's just say competitive business model, not sustainable.
Yes. I think that's fair. That's a good point. I think they're trying to get to sustainability.
I'm not sure, from conversations I've had from reading your piece and so much else, whether this trajectory is at all sustainable. I'm not saying there's going to be a crash. Maybe there's a reset. It does seem that this is a very difficult trajectory to sustain.
Yeah, I agree. And I think they sell people on the idea that they are going to get there. And then they have to make pivots to try and show that they're getting there. But whether or not they can actually get there, we're on totally uncharted territory. The point of the paper is to say, if you want to see where these companies are going, look at their governance structures, look at who their investors are, look at what customer base they're trying to target. And that will tell you a lot about what they actually have to prioritize, and therefore what direction the technology is actually going to go.
You talk about the trade-offs, rewards of customers. Anthropic is very much B2B. Their revenue has grown extraordinarily. OpenAI has been more B2C. Pivoting to B2B, to change that. And because we know, and we can see that it's going to get much more expensive for everybody who is going to be able to access it going forward. So what do you see now in terms of the incentives that are influencing what's happening with these technologies? One, they do need as many people as possible to be able to use it and pay as much as possible in a tiered system. And secondly, you also have China, which is going down a very different route and doing a bottom-up strategy and really making AI pervasive everywhere in a very, very different way. So where do you think we are now?
So I think in some ways things have been tempered a little bit in a good way. Not to say that we've solved all the problems or that, everything's smooth sailing from here, but you do see much less talk about like racing to AGI. I mean, we are in this, those companies do very much feel like this is an arms race. Like you've got to get ahead of your competitors. Right. And that's, driving a lot of acceleration. And at the same time, I think we're seeing, as they're trying to figure out, well, how do we actually make revenue? Who's actually going to find the business model that works? When the startup is really new, you've got to sell some grand idea. Like that's what sells. That's what gets investors to buy in. But we're now going down the road to the point where people are saying, okay, but show me what's really, how is this really going to be useful? What's actually going to make someone want to pay for a subscription or for a company to license the technology. In some ways, that's like a good feedback loop into the system that is tempering a lot of the things that are happening right now. There's legitimate safety concerns that get raised, and I think we're probably moving faster than is prudent given those safety concerns. Another tempering fact is that we have a bunch of different technologies out there. It's not just one company creating one failure point. I'm reticent to make bets because it's hard to tell, but I do see things have shifted. Yeah.
Yes, they have shifted. And I also think part of that is because the fear that has been building really fast since less than a year ago. It's not just, young people who are fearing they're not going to have any jobs and it's going to be hard. It's and kids in schools who are like, what's this going to, where are we going? And are you behaving responsibly, you adults there? As well as a lot of other people who are sort of looking at these, very different and difficult scenarios. And having did a deep dive into AI governance, we are so far away from where we need to be for AI, and then agentic AI is a whole nother ball game. Now, I love AI. I use it all the time. I use it in so many different ways, but I also see how many issues there are with it, with the results. Trying to be a source of truth, I really have to dig very deep, read each research paper to make sure that the nuances, that are solid. Typically not. They're good, they're okay, getting better, but there's certainly the nuances are often missed. Trying to understand how much truth or how much judgment you need for particular pieces of work. So we're really having to rethink not just how we work, how we're designing work, but how much we're using our judgment. What are your thoughts about those type of nuances and the fact that it does make stuff up? It has these functional emotions that I've written recently about, which I find fascinating. It is trained on the entire morass, to some degree, of human content that's been out there for 100 years. And there are lots and lots of not very accurate pieces of information there. So what does that mean in terms of how we need to be trying to think about how, where AI comes from, what it's built upon, in order to be able to use it effectively?
I want to highlight something you said, though, which is I'm optimistic about young people these days, because I think the common trope is that young people are like, whatever, it's not going to hurt me. And that the old people are always the ones with reserve and caution. And I think it's totally flipped right now, where it's people your age and my age that are saying like, yeah, I'm using AI all the time. And then, people have probably heard recently, Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, was giving a commencement address. And when he talked about AI, he got booed at the commencement address. Or I think of my own kids. I have a middle school daughter. And when I tell her, I'm using AI to do this and that for work, she just looks at me like, oh, how could you?
Oh, you're getting the eye roll? Okay.
Yeah.
The AI eye roll?
Yeah,
Dad.
exactly. And she just, she's on YouTube and she's seeing AI slop all over the place and is just saying, this is such garbage. And I think young people have a really healthy dose of skepticism about AI that was probably, in some ways, it's like, too bad we didn't have that back when mobile devices were becoming a new thing or the internet was becoming a new thing. A lot of education has been about just helping students memorize information, learn to reproduce routine skills and processes. And we're moving into an era where AI can do all of that. Like, you're not going to have a competitive advantage in the world if that's all you can do. Now, that doesn't mean those things aren't important, because you can't think critically if you don't know things. You can't just Google whenever you want to understand something in the world. Like, deep thought requires more than the 5 to 7 slots in your short-term memory that you can use to process something. So we do, knowledge is important, skills are important. But I think the world we're moving into is like, if that's all you have, you're going to be in trouble. And we actually need more critical thinking to ask the kind of questions you just raised around like, well, I got this output from AI. In some ways, it can be really helpful because it helps me uncover the nuances more quickly.
Right.
But how do I make sure that those are the actual nuances, that that I'm not just taking bad information and repeating bad information? Like, that skill is going to be, I think, of paramount importance, not only just for the well-being of society, that people are, not getting deceived and not getting led into rabbit holes that are unhealthy or unproductive, but also like for your ability to function in the world, in our economy. Like, you're going to need to be able to think critically and do the things that AI isn't very good at.
So that's a perfect segue to something that you shared a link with me, and you wrote it in December. And I wrote something about this. This is about the fact of what you have called tightening inside corporations, and then some expanding, which is outside. So there's internal and external, which is a lovely way, very nice visual way to show what I have long seen, that way before AI, it has always been foreseen, people who are really looking at all the trajectories, that this companies are going to go to smaller core FTEs, full-time employees, with many, many more networked the external talent pool, the extended, using freelancers and contractors and independent contractors, particularly if you need to be nimble. You cannot have a huge structured, hugely hierarchical, rigid system. And that's when you have had in the past the hiring and firing and hiring and firing, which we know is also really not good for anybody. I do think it's incredibly positive that when you have, say, the millennials who've been looking since Great Recession to have more freelancing, more contracting, being independent contractors, they can then have multiple clients. They are not beholden to one employer, so they have more income security and financial stability. This is where we can be going in a very different way. Now, this possibility with AI is that we can have this extraordinary boost to SMEs, to the entrepreneurial landscape. The way you wrote about it, I'll be sharing the link in the show notes as well. I find this to be the viable vision for all of us.
Yeah. Well, I think it rests on two things you touched on. One is that companies are looking for, how do I do things more efficiently? How do I make more money? And in many ways, it's going to be using AI to reduce the cost of labor, which is a big expense for a lot of companies. And at the same time, I think it's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur, because if you think about this, in the past, if you wanted to start your own business, you needed a team of people to work with you. Well, how do you pay for that team of people? Well, maybe you're connected to the VC community and you can raise money there. Or maybe you have wealthy parents or wealthy relatives or wealthy friends that can give you capital to start your business. But that's not most people.
For sure.
But now we're living in a time when a lot of that team that you'd need, you can hire AI to do a lot of that. So whether it's helping you figure out, like, how do I apply to register a business? And how do I set up my accounting systems? And how do I do marketing? And how do I build a website? Like, so many of those things are it's faster and cheaper to do those because you can leverage AI to do that. And so I think it's lowered the amount of like connections and capital you need to be able to be an entrepreneur and to get things off the ground and to, in many ways to test. You may start a small business that grows and then does need people to do those functions, but at least, getting the business off the ground, getting your minimum viable product, testing the market, seeing, is there actually demand for the thing I'm trying to offer? I think you can get there much more quickly and much more cheaply than you ever have before. So it's a great time to do that.
Exactly. It's hugely exciting. And I think, like, as you pointed out in the article, it doesn't mean that being an entrepreneur is easy or easier than it used. I mean, it's easier because you don't have to spend as much money. You don't have to recoup as much money as you're growing. You don't need to have a million customers or, 10,000 customers. You can go for, 50 or 100. To make a living can be a different goal for now as we're going through this transformational phase, which is very messy, as we're all trying to work out, which way is up, so to speak. In the article, the way you framed, how the big companies are shifting, because I don't see this necessarily be, honestly, that it's just about efficiency. We fudged work to a great degree. And we have had lots of managers in because it hasn't been clear. A lot of our organizations, so the older ones, are full of inefficiencies, and we've sort of put lots of stopgaps in. And so, as you were writing about companies, young companies that build now, even if they don't maximize for AI, they still don't have to have nearly as many people because we have much more clarity about how we're working, and we're actually starting to design work much more intentionally. That is an important part of reducing companies to something which is more effective and building more effective companies. And it's not so much about efficiency. It always sounds bad, but this is really understanding business operations better and how we can build companies better, right?
One of the things I find fascinating about AI that I think touches right into the question you're asking is that in the past, most technologies, the technology gets created and then the human has to figure out how to speak to, how to interface with the technology, right? And then we evolved those interfaces to make them easier. So like early computers,
Right.
you had to use punch cards, right? And then we
Oh
figured actually we
God.
can
Yeah.
do command lines, and actually we can do graphical user interfaces, and actually we can just do touchscreen apps. So the interface gets easier, but it's still the human that has to learn the interface.
Mm,
And AI is this funny technology where, yeah, there is still some learning the interface, but the basics of the interface is human language. And so, in a lot of ways, it's like the interface is now adapting to us instead of us having to adapt to the
right.
interface.
That's
It,
huge.
so, now you think about organizations, a lot of the function that people play is dealing with the messy interfaces. Like, I remember
Oh, that's so true.
Edgar
Oh.
Schein, who was a researcher on organizational culture. I remember in his book he talked about how, I mean, he was talking about in the context of like the tension between different subcultures as an organization, where you have
Mhm.
engineers that want to design a perfect system and they assume that like we'll just design it really well and then it'll run and no one needs to even touch it. And then in
Mm.
reality, you usually have people working on the front lines, like in a factory, that know that the machine never works exactly like it was supposed to, and you need a human to to deal
Right.
with and tweak with the places where the machine isn't quite working right. Um, so people, and another way to think about it is like, different departments in an organization, they have to coordinate and they have to have meetings and discussions and negotiation and collaboration in order to work out the messiness of the interfaces of how the parts of the organization are
Mm.
supposed to work together. And we're moving into an interesting time where AI can now figure out a lot of those messy interfaces. We no longer have to design the system to have a clean interface because the AI can figure out some of those messy interfaces. I
And
think
can
this
help
touches on
some of
what
the
you're saying.
translation of terms. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it can actually give me a few
Hmm.
different ways. It's that empathy. It actually can do it. It can fill in some of the blanks for some of the interpretation.
Hmm.
Very
And
good
I
point.
so then to go back to your broader question, I'll draw on my disruptive innovation roots.
Hmm.
I think established organizations aren't necessarily going to figure these things all out quickly, but I think there will be new entrants, companies that are built with AI that figure out we can actually design organizations differently because AI doesn't just help with some of the tasks to be done in the organization. It can actually
Hmm.
help with designing new interfaces for how the whole organization fits together.
Yes, and I think it's easier for younger companies anyway because they've been built with a technology base mindset. It's kind of like we have to be ready to pivot. We don't want to have things which are incredibly rigid and structured because things are moving, even fast before AI came along. So we have to be ready to shift and to be thinking differently, and to be working cross-functionally, which is becoming more and more the case, particularly now we're seeing the C-suite needs to be working extraordinarily across divisions. Also, I think in terms of when we have, let's just say, millennials and below who are really looking, either they're fed up in large enterprises that they're building up their side hustles, Gen Zs as well, or starting, they can't get a job, or they're just sort of leaving and whatever their job and starting something new. There's a lot more energy and power going into the entrepreneurial, new ventures, all that kind of stuff. Now, funding for that, financing. In the US, VCs are just looking for 30x. Now it's like 3,000 or 300,000x. There needs to be more funding for a 2x or a 3x, where the most people are going to be the 99.9% of companies that are SMEs in most countries, and where, like the UK, where you don't have as much venture money around, but there is more access to government funding. What are the things that you think, from a policy point of view, what can be done structurally that needs to happen to really help energize people who are proactively saying, like, with AI, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to XYZ.
I think there's a lot of interesting ideas out there, and a lot of them I'm not sure how well or how do you get them to work. But I'll throw a
Mhm.
few out there. One is I think we're going to need a shift in how our taxation works. Right now we tax labor, we tax incomes that people make, um, and that creates an incentive for companies to get rid of people instead of figuring out how do you
Sure, yeah.
use machines and capital to to enhance what people do. So I think a policy that shifts toward, and the people I've talked to that know more about this than I do say it's really hard in the details to figure out how do you do this right? How do you measure the
Okay.
right thing that people don't just game? Whenever you start to measure something, you shift behavior.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of answers in the details that I don't know, but shifting towards, hey, let's actually not, tax capital instead of taxing labor, so that
Mm.
it frees up people to have more income to do the things they want to do. I think we do need to come up with new funding models, and I don't know exactly what those look like, but venture capital hasn't existed for all of time. It was invented, when the tech industry was really emerging, and banks didn't have the right risk profile to invest in tech companies.
Mhm.
Go back a few hundred years, even publicly traded stocks has not been around forever. It was invented in the colonial era when they needed to figure out how do we finance a ship that's going to leave port in England and not come back for a year or 2 years. Um,
Right.
so again, I think we're in a time when we need new modes of financing. I don't know what those will look like, but I wonder if it can be something along the lines of, community-based capital, where it's not billionaires trying to figure out how do I 3,000x my money, but people in communities that, the boomer generation that has more wealth, that's
Extraordinary.
succeeded
Yeah.
in their careers, figuring out, well, where could I put my money that, no, like, it's not going to make me into the next billionaire, but
And it could be into the local community because I want my community to survive. I'm also concerned about social unrest to keep us away from the dystopian scenario. How about Sam Altman's ideas? Some of those things that he was talking about,
like
AI.
guaranteed basic income, that or other things.
I've read a lot about UBI, for the last 15 years. It has some very, very compelling aspects to it. It doesn't mean that people don't work. They absolutely do work. It just changes the dynamics of it. People want a purpose, and whatever that work may be. And I, do quote the fact that it was Nixon who actually proposed it first to the U.S. government. It was from a Republican point of view. I think there are many, many other things in between there. I think going to a shorter work week, whether it's a 4-day work week, we talk a lot about the extremes, particularly in the US. I think there's a different range, discussed in Europe and in the UK. Already in the Netherlands, you have a 32-hour work week. In France, I think it's 38 or maybe going down to 35, and governments are already thinking about that. What do you think that some of these other middle ground models, other solutions are? If it's going to go so much more to, entrepreneurship and small and medium-sized businesses, there still need to be some more solutions that are going to help us move to a different game.
Yeah. I don't know that I have a perspective on this is the ideal solution of all those solutions out there, but I think I can offer some things that in terms of framing. One is that someone said, we have a long running experiment of universal basic income. It's called trust fund babies. And
Oh my God.
oh,
that's hilarious.
And I think when you look at the outcomes from that population, you see that policy. And I think this is actually true of a lot of things. It's actually true of every technology.
So funny.
Is a technology good or bad? It's actually usually both. Like nuclear energy can blow up cities and can power cities. Electricity, the internet, the internet can connect people around the world, can help make new businesses possible. It can also be used to spread misinformation. I think AI fits in the same category. I think guaranteed basic income is also one of these things where, and the trust funds prove it. Like some people, they just spend their living doing terrible things, and other people use it to go start new businesses and
right. Yeah.
And I don't think there's a way to control and make sure that we only get the upside and not the downside on any of those technologies or on that policy. I do think too that, money doesn't make people happy, but getting people to a basic level of security really helps a lot. I mean, I think often of myself, like I'm married, I have 3 kids. There's a lot of interesting things I might have tried to do with my life if I wasn't worried about, but I still have to make sure we can pay the mortgage. Lots of entrepreneurship I would have tried if I wasn't worried about, but I need a stable paycheck every month. And so I'm not going to take those risks. That's not the answer on how you craft the policy the right way, but I think it's maybe some helpful ways to think about those kinds of policies. there needs to be a shift in how in the experiences we give young people that help them think about the world they're moving into. Schools have an express curriculum that says you're going to learn math and English and history and science, but there's also kind of an unwritten curriculum in the way that we do conventional schooling, which says successful students are those who can sit quietly, who don't speak until they're called on after they've raised their hands, who can show up to classes on time, who make sure they turn in all their homework on time. And it's this implicit curriculum of like compliance leads to success. And I'd say for a lot of modern history and corporations, like that's been true. Like someone who succeeds in a corporation is someone who is reliable for a corporation, someone who can be a reliable cog in that bigger machine, which means showing up on time, making sure you get your work done on time, all those things.
Right.
But I think we're moving into a world, as we've already been talking about, where those ladders, those long-standing ladders to success are not as reliable as they've been in the past. And so we're doing young people a disservice when we're telling them, oh, just climb on that ladder and just go up the rungs. And as long as you're diligent and hardworking and smart and you climb those rungs, you'll live a comfortable life. Like I think that deal isn't
It's
as
gone.
realizable as it used to be. And we need to actually, yeah.
As far as I see, it's completely gone. When I started in the future work, and I was looking all the way back to the sort of the early 1800s, this was actually the Prussian factory school system to raise compliant workers for the factories.
Yeah.
Some of the most fascinating people who've really broken out and created the most amazing companies, they were really being disruptive. They were behind that disruptive innovation. And I think absolutely the system does us a disservice. And that's why we have to change that in the school system, because it's not going to help anybody. And when you have so many different careers and so many choices and new jobs that are appearing out of nowhere, how are they going to be ready for that if they still have this sort of rote learning type school system, which does not help them really challenge everything before them? And of course, then they challenge some of their, the people above them and who don't like that. Thomas, what haven't I asked you that I should have done?
One of the things I am passionate about, really the core of my work, is about mapping out how does education get transformed? Because I think this is an imperative. Our society needs it. And I think the good news is that it's actually happening. It's just happening very slowly. We study disruptive innovation, and usually the disruptive innovations that get a lot of attention are when an industry just seems to get upended overnight, like Blockbuster getting disrupted by Netflix.
Right.
But historically, there's been disruptions that happen over long periods of time. Like the airline industry didn't replace rail travel till roughly 50 years after the Wright brothers flew their first plane as a way to cross country travel, right?
Yep.
The telephone. Again, long story between when Alexander Graham Bell invents a telephone and telephones replace telegraphs as the way that you communicate across a continent or between continents. Education, I think for a lot of reasons, is one of those slower disruptions. And that's really the heart of my work. But I think there's also actions that school system leaders, entrepreneurs, policymakers can take that will hopefully accelerate that process of helping us reinvent education.
What are some of those? Whether they're entrepreneurs, whether they're potential policymakers, or they talk to policymakers, or parents who are talking to schools, because everybody is trying to work out what to do about the education, because everybody is concerned about it.
I think one thing is, if you're an entrepreneur, focus on the people on the margins. The truth is, despite all the drawbacks of conventional education, it still works well enough that most people aren't ready to leave it. And the things that we need are not developed enough to give those people confidence to make a switch. I mean, I see this in my own family. Like, I have kids that complain all the time about how school's boring and about how school is frustrating. And yet when I ask them, hey, should we try something different? Should we try to start our own like micro school at home? They say, absolutely not, because I still want to be be in the band. I want to play sports. I want to go to the dances. I want to have lunch with my friends. And they're not my own kids. Like they're doing fine. They're getting good grades. Their teachers tell them they're doing well. Like why mess up a thing that seems like it's working? But some of our research looked at when families are picking things like micro schools or just even unconventional options that are available often within school systems. Often what's driving them is one or two things. One is that the system isn't working for them. they're getting bullied, they're falling behind academically, the solutions they're getting aren't working. So they're desperate for like, parents are saying like, help me not fight with my child every morning, telling them they need to go to this experience that they hate. Help
Right.
us find something they're not going to hate. That's fertile ground for really saying, how do we think differently about schooling? The other end of the spectrum is people who, kids that may do fine in the system, but they and or their parents just have a strong sense of schooling as it is today is not really what I want. And I'm willing to actually give up the band and the sports and the dances because I want my kid to have more time to develop their entrepreneurial ventures or
Okay.
to
Yeah.
develop their talents in something they're passionate about. So I think that's the fertile ground to innovate. And it's happening,
Okay.
within education through, in the US, we have lots of school districts and they're all kind of their own entities. And within many of those school districts, there are hybrid virtual schools, there are district sponsored micro schools, there's all versions of alternative
Interesting.
education
Okay.
where they're serving those needs. And then outside of public education, there's been a lot of attention since COVID around the emergence of micro schools and hybrid homeschooling and these other out of system
Right.
options. I think that's the space that's most ripe for innovation because it gets far enough away from the gravitational pull of the conventional education system that you can do things differently. Now it's going to be a long time though. Like, one of the catches of ed tech companies, and this goes back to venture capital, is that say you want to start an ed tech company to help be a part of this transformation, and you go get venture capital and they say, okay, well, we want you to, 10x in 3 to 5 years.
Right.
Well, there's not a known market of these little things that are on the margins, but there is a big known market of the conventional school system. So they end up, this is a similar value network problem. They end up
Right.
building tools for conventional schooling because that's where their customer base, that's where the known addressable customer base is. So,
And AI may make that easier because you could customize it more easily across in different school systems, but have the same basic building blocks, so to speak. I also do see more innovation happening in the college system because honestly, right now, no matter the fact that people don't want to be leaving college in the US, the average is $30,000, or it was. Maybe I think 18 months ago, the average debt that somebody left with was $30,000. And people don't want to go, have that when they're going into a very uncertain job situation. We are now having more solutions which are 2 years in college and then maybe one which is a work study experience. I think there are going to be more and more and more of those. And I think more and more people will be dropping out because too much is happening. If you're going to try and be an entrepreneur, and if you're going to be, trying to build on the skills that you learned in high school, you're going to need them quickly, or you're going to need an environment, if it's in school and a lab and R&D, and then connection with corporations, whether it's access to funding or research materials, and you're going to need much more connection. And so maybe there's some really interesting ways that we can be bringing different institutions and entities together that bridge between high school and then through college and that type of higher education going into this. So I think there's some really interesting things that can happen potentially faster there.
Yeah.
I also was at a conference in Copenhagen, which was about AI and AI safety and kids. And they had a number of kids who were speaking, and they're not happy because, as you said, they are very aware, very thoughtful, concerned, and they don't have the power. They did say two things. One is we want our voices to be in the part of the conversation as we're trying to find solutions. And two, you guys are responsible. So,
yeah.
So for anybody out there, do you have a couple of, 3 short takeaways to suggest to people in terms of how to be thinking about AI, thinking about education, and what they can be doing tomorrow or next week?
I'll focus on one and maybe tie in a few facets of that one. I'd say the one is focus on trying to understand what are the problems that need to be solved out in the world. The problems for your family, your community, society, different segments of society. I think that's going to be a really valuable mindset because no matter what happens with AI, I think we're still a long way from humans reaching a state of the world where there's no more problems to be solved. There's no more challenges to be tackled.
Oh, yeah.
We've already explored everything. There's nothing to be learned in the universe. I think that we're still a long way off. And so I think as long as you maintain that curiosity for understanding those problems and a desire to try and solve them, I think that is a mindset that is going to serve people well, in contrast with the one we've talked about of, well, I just follow a path, that there's a ladder and my job is just to climb it.
Very true. And that also goes, as far as I'm concerned, to the friction. Like if you're always thinking like, what is it that I can do? What is it that I can solve? You're actually creating that friction for yourself, because we as humans haven't sort of said, okay, we've invented the car and now we're done.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thomas, thank you so much.
This has been such a pleasure.
It's been such a great conversation. Really, really appreciate all your insights, your ideas, and the takeaways as well. And there's so much more that I have to be reading and thinking about in terms of, funding and schools and tax policies and all that kind of thing. So thank you very, very much indeed, Thomas.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks again so much to Thomas Arnett, Senior Research Fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute. You can find out more about Thomas on LinkedIn, as well as go to christenseninstitute.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also write a quick review wherever you watch or listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter on Substack or LinkedIn. Thanks for watching. Until next time.